In July 1978, Kazuo Taoka was sitting quietly inside a nightclub in Kyoto with 5 of his men when a young man in a white shirt suddenly stood up, drew a .38 caliber pistol, and emptied the magazine toward him. The gunman fled, while Taoka was rushed away in an armored Cadillac under police escort. That attack belongs much later in the Yakuza story, but it reveals the scale of the organization the story eventually produced. A world of rival clans, powerful bosses, and violence that could erupt in public. To understand how it reached that point, the source takes the story back more than 3 centuries. The Yakuza are presented as one of the world's most powerful and mysterious criminal organizations, often described as Japan's mafia. At their height, the source says they could number around 180,000 people, and their history stretches back more than 400 years. Tattoos became one of their most recognizable symbols, but the organization was also associated with the idea of Ninkyo Dantai, criminal group bound by a strong code of conduct. It was divided into many smaller groups described as Boryokuden, each led by a chief known as an oyabun. The problem is that there is no single agreed origin story. The source gives 4 competing theories, all pointing toward people living on the margins of Japan's rigid social order. The first theory begins around 1612 with the Kabukimono, a name roughly associated in the source with people seen as wild or eccentric. They were said to descend from fallen or masterless samurai. They dressed strangely or unusual hairstyles, used distinctive slang, carried swords, and were known for bad behavior. They also protected one another fiercely, even when that loyalty placed them against their own families. The source connects this world to the long peace of the Tokugawa era, when more than 500,000 samurai are said to have lost their positions and become ronin. With no master and little direction, some roamed Japan in bands, robbing villages and small towns. The most violent Kabukimono were said to attack innocent people, simply to test a fighting technique or the sharpness of a katana. Yet the same period also established the quality the source repeatedly treats as central to later Yakuza identity: unshakable loyalty. Members protected one another and formed clans that behaved like blood families. The second origin theory reverses the first. In this version, the Yakuza did not descend from the Kabukimono at all. They emerged from people who saw themselves as enemies of those violent ronin, defenders of the oppressed, and protectors of ordinary residents. Because Kabukimono were accused of extorting and killing innocent people, these self-described defenders organized to fight them. In this version, the organization begins not as the predator, but as the group claiming to protect communities from predators. The third theory points to Bakuto, professional gamblers who ran underground gambling gatherings in the mid-1700s. The source links the word Yakuza to a card combination in Hanafuda, 8, 9, and 3. In the explanation given, those numbers produce a worthless hand, and the term gradually became associated with something useless or with outcasts and bandits whose activities society rejected. The meaning of the name itself therefore becomes part of the story of exclusion. The fourth theory points to tekiya, street merchants active. In the 1800s, they often came from backgrounds described as homeless, poor, criminal, or otherwise excluded from Japan's highly structured hierarchy. For people with nowhere else to belong, the group became a substitute family, a place to receive help, attention, and protection. These 4 stories contradict one another, but the source draws one common thread through all of them. Kabukimono, their supposed opponents, Bakuto, and tekiya were all linked to people who stood outside respectable society. Whether they were feared bandits, self-proclaimed defenders, gamblers, or street merchants, the clan offered something the surrounding order did not. It offered belonging, loyalty, and a family strong enough to survive beyond the lives of its individual members. Once these groups began organizing themselves as families, the structure of the Yakuza became one of its defining strengths. At the top stood an oyabun, a father figure or clan head, while the kobun were the children or protégés beneath him. The relationship was presented as more than a criminal chain of command. It borrowed from Japanese social relationships in which a senior figure offered guidance, protection, and assistance, while the junior figure returned loyalty and support. The source describes that loyalty as extreme. A kobun could be expected to place himself in danger to protect his oyabun. If the boss committed a crime, the subordinate might accept punishment or prison in his place. A saying used in the source captures the logic. If the oyabun said a passing crow was white, the kobun was expected to agree even though the bird was plainly black. Obedience came before personal judgment. This also made advancement different from the ruthless internal competition associated in the source with some American criminal organizations. A low-ranking Yakuza member was not automatically trying to overthrow his superior. He could spend years performing humble duties, polishing dice, cleaning the oyabun's house, running errands, or even caring for children. The structure rewarded patience and devotion as much as force. Another symbol of belonging was the full-body tattoo. The source says tattooing had once been used by Japanese authorities as punishment, marking criminals so they could be identified and excluded from ordinary society. By the late 1700s, Yakuza members had turned that mark of exclusion into an identity of their own. The markings became larger and more elaborate, spreading across the body and becoming especially popular among Bakuto. Traditional tattooing was slow and painful. Ink was inserted under the skin with simple tools, and even in later times a full back piece from the neck to the tailbone could require close to 100 hours. That difficulty gave the tattoo several meanings. It could demonstrate courage, endurance, masculinity, and commitment. It also made marginality visible. The wearer was literally carrying a permanent sign that he stood apart from conventional society. Some members later adopted modern tattoo techniques, while others kept older methods because tradition itself carried status in the underworld. The organization, however, could not remain trapped in feudal habits. Under Emperor Meiji from 1868, Japan rapidly industrialized and pushed away the remnants of the old feudal order. The source describes this first great period of economic transformation as another opportunity for Yakuza expansion. By the end of the 1800s and into the early 1900s, Yakuza groups were becoming more organized and spreading through a wider range of illegal activities. The growth of film and entertainment created new opportunities, and some organizations began bribing police. Modernization changed the state around them, so Yakuza leaders concluded that they also had to modernize. Crime alone was no longer enough. The next step was politics. The source presents Mitsuru Toyama as a figure who symbolized the new connection between Yakuza and political nationalism. He was described as an ultranationalist who admired samurai tradition from an early age. In his 20s, he joined one of the last samurai rebellions against the authority of Emperor Meiji. The rebellion failed, and Toyama spent 3 years in prison. After his release, Toyama and his organization joined with one of Japan's early nationalist groups. From there, the source says, he used his followers against political opponents, including ordering Kobun to kill certain left-wing politicians who obstructed his goals. At the same time, he worked to reshape his public image. In territory under his influence, he was portrayed almost like a Robin Hood figure and gained the reputation of a popular protector. That combination of underworld discipline and political legitimacy became more powerful when Toyama created Jinyasa, described in the source as the Dark Ocean Society, in 1881. It became a nationalist federation and a model for later secret patriotic organizations, bringing together former Tekiya and Bakuto. By the end of the 19th century, ultranationalism had become an important part of the political environment described by the source, and Yakuza networks were no longer simply hiding beneath society. They were beginning to build alliances with people who operated openly inside it. The political door opened by Toyama did not close with him. In the early 20th century, the source says more Yakuza syndicates appeared with links to politicians and major businessmen from the beginning. One of the most important emerged in Kobe, Yamaguchi-gumi, the family the source describes as the largest Yakuza organization in history. By the early 1930s, Yamaguchi-gumi had pushed aside rivals and risen toward the top of Japan's underworld. Its expansion was closely associated with Kazuo Daoka, a boss portrayed as both ruthless and obsessed with organization. Through the 1930s and 1940s, he turned the syndicate into a disciplined criminal force with almost 13,000 members and influence across 36 of Japan's 47 districts. Then the country entered a crisis far larger than any gang conflict. Japan went to war with the United States, and after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the country surrendered on September 2, 1945. The American occupation began in a Japan where many people lacked basic necessities, especially food. In that environment, the source says ordinary residents increasingly depended on black markets, including markets controlled by Yakuza groups such as Yamaguchi-gumi. Those networks helped people obtain food when conventional supply systems were failing. The same ultranationalist organizations that had once defined themselves through militant politics were now portrayed as helping to rebuild a defeated country. That aid improved the Yakuza's public standing and created a sense, at least in the source's telling, that parts of society owed them something. The occupation initially brought pressure against the Yakuza, but the source says the relationship changed because both American authorities and ultranationalist Yakuza shared hostility toward communism. Cooperation against communist movements gave the organization new room to operate. Rice and other aid moved through black markets under Yakuza influence, while the underworld gained political and economic strength. The postwar period also produced another powerful ultranationalist figure, Yoshio Kodama. The source presents him as a successor to Toyama's method of connecting the underworld to politics. On December 24, 1948, the story says, that connection moved into a new phase as Kodama developed cooperation with the CIA during the 1950s and 1960s. The source claims that the CIA secretly funded Japanese nationalists, including circles associated with Kodama, as part of an anti-communist strategy in Asia. Right-wing politicians and Yakuza networks benefited indirectly, while millions of dollars were said to be paid each year to support Japan's conservative, liberal Democratic Party. In the source's narrative, Kodama's value came from his ability to operate between political institutions and the criminal underworld. The result was a Yakuza that had become more influential than before the war. The American occupation, instead of simply destroying the organization, is portrayed as a period in which it expanded politically and economically. But by the early 1950s, Japan itself was changing again. Industry recovered from wartime destruction, and the San Francisco Peace Treaty, described by the source as taking effect in April 1952, marked the formal end of the American occupation. Japan regained sovereignty and turned its attention toward rebuilding a stable society and economy. For the Yakuza, stability was a problem. Food became available through normal channels, and the black market profits that had grown during wartime scarcity began to disappear. The same organization that had survived feudal collapse, industrialization, war, defeat, and occupation now faced another transition. Its old markets were shrinking, and its bosses had to find new businesses or lose the power they had accumulated. The answer was another round of adaptation. As black market profits declined, the source says Yakuza groups moved deeper into prostitution, entertainment, gambling, extortion, and especially narcotics. The drug trade was not presented as entirely new. During World War II, the source says methamphetamine had been distributed among Japanese soldiers so they would feel less fear and fatigue in combat. Large quantities were produced, leaving substantial stocks after the war. Because Yakuza networks already had connections reaching into government and the occupation-era underworld, the source says they learned about those supplies and distributed drugs across Japan as the country recovered. Combined with prostitution, entertainment, gambling, and extortion, narcotics helped restore Yakuza profits. By the late 1950s, the source describes another visible shift. Gangsters began copying the appearance and codes of American criminals they had seen through Hollywood films. Dark suits, white shirts, ties, black clothing, and sunglasses became part of the new style. The most dramatic change was numerical. Tokyo police were said to estimate around 70,000 gang members in 1958. 5 years later, in 1963, the source gives a figure of 184,000 people connected to Yakuza syndicates, a total that compares with the size of Japan's entire military at the time. Power also became more concentrated. Tokyo had once resisted control by a single syndicate, but Inagawa Kai, founded by Kakuji Inagawa, grew strong enough to dominate much of the capital's criminal world. A potential conflict with Taoka's organization was diffused under Yoshio Kodama's influence. On October 24, 1972, the source says Inagawa Kai and Taoka's Yakuza reached an affiliation under a broader arrangement tied to Yamaguchi-gumi and Kodama. By then, Kodama stood in both the public and hidden worlds. The source describes him as holding politicians in one hand and Yakuza forces in the other. During the 1960s and 1970s, he's portrayed as one of Japan's most powerful men and as a political representative for several major Yakuza organizations. That position collapsed in scandal. The source connects the crisis to a story beginning in 1957, when representatives of the American military contractor Lockheed sought to sell fighter aircraft to Japan. The Japanese government, according to the transcript, contacted Kodama, who used his political connections to support the American company. The arrangement involved enormous bribes. The scandal became public in 1976. National coverage angered Japanese citizens and damaged respect for Kodama and the Yakuza organizations associated with him. Kodama was prosecuted and accused of evading $6.5 million in income taxes between 1972 and 1975. The source also says he received another $3.6 million in foreign currency payments. The reaction was not limited to courtrooms. Angry demonstrators went to his home. Former ultranationalist admirers demanded that he atone for disgracing Japan, and some political allies urged him to commit harakiri. The scandal became so intense that a former actor and ultranationalist partisan, identified in the source as Mitsuyasu Manu, attempted to kill Kodama by crashing an airplane into his home. The attacker missed the target and died in the crash. Kodama's health then declined rapidly. He died in his sleep after a stroke in Tokyo on January 17, 1984, before the scandal trial had fully concluded. His fall and death badly damaged the public image of the Yakuza. People increasingly viewed the organization differently. Yet damaged prestige did not mean immediate collapse. The source is explicit that negative publicity and public anger were not enough to remove Yakuza power from Japan's underworld. The political bridge that had carried the organization to its peak was breaking, but the syndicates themselves still controlled enormous networks, money, and manpower. When Kodama's influence began to fade, Kazuo Taoka was already an aging but still dominant figure. The source says that at 65 he remained one of the most influential Yakuza leaders in Japan, with almost 120,000 Yakuza still in the broader underworld around him. Unlike Kodama, Taoka understood the value of staying in the shadows, but even his power could not protect him from the violence inside that world. In July 1978, the attack in Kyoto changed everything. Taoka sat in a nightclub with 5 of his men when a 25-year-old member of Matsuda-gumi, a rival active in Western Japan, rose from his seat and fired a .38 caliber pistol at him. The attacker escaped and Taoka was carried to an armored Cadillac and taken to a nearby hospital under police protection. Yamaguchi-gumi's size and network made retaliation swift. The source says the oyabun of Matsuda-gumi was found only weeks later and brutally killed on a mountainside near Kobe. Yamaguchi-gumi then attacked Matsuda-gumi directly. Fighting broke out openly in the streets during daylight, and even law enforcement could not stop the disorder. The revenge spread further when leaders from 5 other clans affiliated with Matsuda-gumi were killed in another bloody retaliation 2 days later. Taoka survived, but the gunshot wounds weakened him. He was forced to step away for a time, and the source treats that moment as the beginning of the end for the boss who had held the Yamaguchi-gumi together. The syndicate had depended heavily on his personal leadership. Without his full control, it weakened, factions began to split, and senior figures started positioning themselves as possible successors. Taoka died of a heart attack in July 1981, ending 35 years of leadership over the syndicate. The source calls Japan's strongest Yakuza organization of the 20th century. At the time of his death, Yamaguchi-gumi alone was said to generate more than $460 million a year. His funeral demonstrated the scale of his authority. The source says around 1,300 Yakuza members from 12,000 clans gathered in Kobe to honor him as their oyabun or godfather. Gang leaders and prominent businessmen attended, and flowers arrived from across Japan. The most surprising development came afterward. Taoka's wife, Fumiko Taoka, temporarily took control of Yamaguchi-gumi. The source presents this as unprecedented in Yakuza history. Fumiko understood that her role was temporary, filling the vacuum until a male successor could emerge. The first expected successor was Kanichi Yamamoto, founder of Yamaguchi-gumi, described as the largest branch syndicate inside Yamaguchi-gumi. But Yamamoto died only 7 months after Taoka. That left nearly 12,000 gangs within Japan's largest criminal syndicate under the temporary leadership of a woman until 1984, when Masahisa Takanaka was selected as the new boss. Even as Yamaguchi-gumi fought through succession, the broader underworld remained divided among powerful families. During the 1980s, Yamaguchi-gumi and Inagawa-kai were still two of the leading syndicates. The source also describes Sumiyoshi-kai as an organization with no affiliation to another major Yakuza clan, and an unusual structure because it did not operate around a single oyabun in the conventional way. Under the leadership described in the transcript, Inagawa-kai became the largest criminal syndicate in Tokyo, with nearly 7,500 people involved in narcotics, gambling, and extortion across around 100 districts beyond the capital. In only a few years, the group pushed Yakuza activity to a level the source describes as unprecedented. But once again, the Yakuza's fortunes were tied to Japan's economy. At the beginning of the 1990s, Japan entered one of its worst economic crises in decades. The source says the downturn hit Inagawa-kai and the wider underworld hard. Its leaders struggled to adapt while his health deteriorated. In October 1990, he stepped down as oyabun and retired, then died about a year later. After several years of prosperity, the conditions that had supported rapid Yakuza growth were disappearing. Leadership was changing, the economy was collapsing, and the underworld was moving toward a crisis that would finally provoke a direct response from the Japanese state. After 4 years of prosperity, the source says Inagawa-kai's income fell sharply. The economic crisis was followed by a decade of scandal, including bad loans totaling as much as $288 billion. In the source's telling, those losses exposed how deeply Yakuza influence had entered the economy and how poorly law enforcement had contained organizations that generated enormous income while remaining outside normal tax collection. For senior police officials, the accumulation of scandals became impossible to ignore. Billions of dollars had been lost, corruption was widespread, Yakuza extortion continued, and gang wars had produced public bloodshed. The conclusion was that stronger action was required. On March 1, 1992, the Japanese government enacted what the source describes as a law for preventing illegal acts by Boryakudan members, an anti-gang law aimed at Yakuza and other criminal groups. For the first time in the source's narrative, the state formally treated the Yakuza as a specific social crime problem requiring targeted measures. The organizations did not accept the new rules quietly. Yakuza groups organized demonstrations and filed lawsuits against the government. At first, the law appeared to have a major effect. Police announced that thousands of members and clans had ended their activities and that dozens of criminal groups had dissolved. The source argues that the public numbers were misleading. Tens of thousands of people may have left formal Yakuza membership, but many remained loyal to the underworld. Instead of disappearing, They changed status and became partners or associates, placing themselves farther from dark suspicion. As a result, the source says the law reduced the total number of recognized Yakuza by only about 10,000. By 1994, there were still almost 80,000 Yakuza, and nearly half were now categorized as partners. The crackdown therefore changed visibility more than loyalty. It pushed activity deeper underground and made intelligence gathering more difficult. Some leaders responded by promising to end cooperation with authorities. More importantly, the crackdown created pressure to find money elsewhere. Gambling and extortion income had fallen sharply while domestic scrutiny had increased. The Yakuza had survived previous crises by adapting to a new environment. The source says the same logic now pushed them beyond Japan. To regain their former strength, they needed new structures, new working methods, and new markets. By the early 1990s, that search was already turning the organization toward international crime. The new markets began with some of the Yakuza's darkest businesses. In the early 1990s, the source says Yakuza groups expanded into international trafficking of women. Tens of thousands of women across Asia were lured with promises of legitimate work and money. According to the transcript, many were then drugged, exploited, and forced into prostitution or brothels in Japan. The trade became a business worth billions of dollars each year. Narcotics offered even larger opportunities. Methamphetamine was already familiar to the Japanese underworld, and the source says it was produced elsewhere in East Asia before being trafficked internationally by Yakuza networks. The organizations also pursued heroin in Southeast Asia, along with cocaine and other drugs. The rule was simple. If a drug produced large profits, it attracted Yakuza interest. In the 1990s, the source reports contacts between representatives of Colombian cartels and Yamaguchi-gumi. The two sides allegedly planned to move large quantities of cocaine into Japan. Over several years, Colombian distributors were said to operate in major Japanese cities, including Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, and Kobe, the center of Yamaguchi-gumi power. For international law enforcement agencies, the source portrays this alliance as a nightmare, a powerful Japanese syndicate connected with an organization willing to use extreme violence. After links with Colombian criminals, the Yakuza also developed a business with Russian mafia groups. The source describes those groups as less organized than the Italian mafia or Japanese Yakuza, but exceptionally ruthless and commercially sharp, with former KGB and police personnel involved in some networks. As the Soviet Union collapsed and trade with Japan expanded, criminal collaboration also grew. Stolen cars and consumer goods could move from Japan to Russia, while weapons and women moved in the opposite direction. By the late 2000s, the source says Yakuza groups had even established contacts with New York mafia organizations. American criminals chose cooperation rather than direct competition, particularly around secret gambling. New York police initially suspected the local mafia would resist a Japanese rival, but the source says the relationship was instead treated as a way to expand business into Japan. By the end of the 20th century and into the next, Yakuza networks had established themselves in multiple countries and expanded their activities internationally. But internationalization created a deeper problem. The source argues that the more the Yakuza mixed with other criminal syndicates, the more their old identity weakened. Earlier generations had claimed to live by rules of loyalty, obligation, respect, and clan discipline. The new generation increasingly behaved like ordinary profit-driven gangsters. An older Kyoto Yakuza leader, identified in the source as Tokutaro Takayama, complained to a reporter that Yakuza of the 2000s no longer believed in their traditions or even in the identity of being Yakuza. The old expectations of duty, respect, and dignity were fading. The criminal world of the 21st century, as the source describes it, rewarded cunning and personal profit more than a warrior-like ideology or absolute loyalty. For the first time, members were increasingly acting for themselves instead of for the clan as a whole. Gang wars that killed civilians became one sign of that change. The source says Tokyo Metropolitan Police had already observed a decline in solidarity and obedience among members in 1984, linking it to the retirement of elderly bosses who had once enforced strict discipline. As older oyabun died or retired, younger bosses took power and gradually changed the structure. High finance and international expansion grew at the same time that the last major bosses shaped by the occupation era were disappearing. The source does not present every young member as personally responsible. Instead, it describes a generation that accepted old customs less readily because those customs seemed to obstruct modern criminal business. Fewer members were willing to risk their lives or devote themselves completely to an oyabun. The silence that had once made disobedience almost unthinkable began to crack, and some members openly challenged their clan leaders. Accumulating wealth and succeeding in business became the primary goals for many members by the late 2000s. That shift produced a strange ending to a 400-year story. The source says the Yakuza are now dramatically weaker, with membership falling sharply and fewer young Japanese choosing to join. After anti-Yakuza laws were introduced, authorities increased pressure on the organization and even offered members paths back into ordinary society. The organization survived feudal collapse, industrialization, war, occupation, political scandal, economic crisis, and legal crackdowns because it repeatedly changed its form. Yet the source closes on the idea that the final transformation may be the one it cannot survive. The loyalty system that once held the clans together has eroded, recruitment has fallen, and a criminal organization once portrayed as the king of Japan's underworld now stands near extinction.